Hi again. Welcome to Week 7, History 322U, Portland State University. This is part 1 of the Week 7 lecture. This is mostly about China, with a bit about the Korean War. Next week, we'll get more into the Cold War in the rest of Asia. And following that, we will discuss the division of Korea, and then start to move into the modern era, the post-Mao era, the era of economic change and prosperity in Asia. But first, we'll talk about the post-war period, the Cold War itself, starting with the conflict in Korea and the disasters that occurred in China. Let's go on past slide 2 to slide 3. The two Koreas have had different names since 1946-47. In the South, they call themselves Taehan Minguk, or Dahan Minguo, the Great Han Republic. Literally speaking, the Great Han Republic. In English, the Republic of Korea, Dahan Minguo. You can see a similarity, or you can hear a similarity between the two languages there, and that's because the Korean name is sinified Korean. It's based on Chinese characters. And as we'll see in a moment, all Korean names of people are also based on Chinese characters. The North calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in English, the Chosun Minju Chui Inmin Konghwaguk, which in Chinese is the Chaoshen Minju Zhuyi Renmin Gongheguo. So there's a similarity there too, and it's the same thing. The names of that country, the names of the two countries, the name of this country is based on sinified Korean, using Hanja, using the Chinese characters that came into use during the time of the Chosun dynasty. And Chosun is, or Joseon in the Korean, is the name adopted by the North for its society. Let's go on to slide 4 to talk about the leaders on the two sides. The man known in English as Syngman Rhee, or Lee Sung-man, was a nationalist activist in the 1890s and a member of the Independence Club at the time of the Declaration of Independence that was largely futile on the 1st of March of 1919, which we've talked about before. Soon after that, he was forced to leave the country, and he became an overseas activist for Korean independence. Quite a resilient and determined man was Syngman Rhee. He became familiar to the U.S. State Department as the advocate for Korean independence. He ended up earning a master's at Harvard and a PhD at Princeton, and partly because he was so familiar and was considered reliable, he was installed quite, I wouldn't say exactly the same as Kim Il-sung was installed by the Russians, but he was installed by the Americans when they returned, well, they didn't return, when they came into Korea after World War II. And if you'll take a look at the Kim reading for this week, you'll notice that when the Americans came into Korea, they considered Korea to be an occupied enemy territory, really an enemy territory. They came in and gave orders and basically looked upon the Koreans as enemy personnel without fully realizing the extent to which Koreans wished for independence and were happy to have an opportunity to take it. If you've read the readings from the other Kim, the woman who married a Korean, as is the title of her book, then you'll see how difficult were the relations between Americans and Koreans on the ground during this period. And indeed, I can testify as someone who was an Army officer in Korea for 2 years, from 1979 to 81, that a lot of the complaints that were made in that book that's on reserve and was also posted on D2L, a lot of those complaints about Americans acting the way they did were current 30 years later, 40 years later when I was there. Nowadays, things may be a little bit different, but I can't judge that. So Syngman Rhee was very much in favor of a war to liberate the North from communist oppression, and he actually lobbied the United States to assist him in attacking the North in order to unify Korea. The Americans didn't want to do that because they recognized how difficult that would be and how much the Russians would oppose it. Therefore, it would lead potentially to conflict between the two larger powers, and Washington didn't want that. So they did not assist Syngman Rhee. As a matter of fact, they judged him to be unreliable in keeping the peace on the peninsula, and so they did not supply him with heavy weapons. This led to a power imbalance that caused the North to realize that they could make potentially a successful attack. Syngman Rhee stayed in power all through the 1950s, and if you take a look at the Kim reading, you can see that he was forced to leave Korea after fixing elections, or probably fixing elections in 1960. He was not a Democrat by any stretch of the imagination. He was holding elections to keep the Americans happy and was inclined toward being a dictator. Let's go on to slide 5. Speaking of dictators, one of my faves, Kim Il-sung, or Jin Er-chung, again a Chinese-based name in the Korean language using Hanja, the Chinese characters as adopted in the Korean language during the Joseon dynasty. Kim Il-sung was a Soviet army captain. During World War II, he was in Siberia and operated in Manchuria against the Japanese. He was allowed to operate also in Korea against the Japanese in a rather far-sighted policy on the part of the Soviets to prepare themselves for the end of Japanese influence. And so the faction of people that he headed when he was installed by the Soviets was referred to as the Manchurian Partisans faction. He had rivals who were listed in the Kim reading, and these rivals either disappeared or were mysteriously killed in the 2-year period after Kim Il-sung arrived and was placed in power by the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung decided that he could successfully invade the South, and unwisely, the first Stalin and then Mao agreed to this. I say unwisely because of the geopolitical implications of a united Korean peninsula, which has been mentioned before in this course, and is not mentioned very much when Westad considers Mao's motivations for entering the Korean War on the North side. Westad talks about solidarity with the socialist camp and maintaining China's respect and all that stuff, and I think that stuff counts. Human motivations are always complicated. However, I think that the idea of having American soldiers pissing in the Yalu River was probably a little bit more important to Mao. And indeed, that was sort of a fashionable thing to do when the Americans got up north, but I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now we've talked about the background of the up and coming conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Let's go on to slide 6 and talk about what was happening as the nationalists slowly but surely evacuated the mainland for Taiwan. Now, they did not just all get on boats and go at once. Chiang Kai-shek himself played it cool in southern China between January and April of 1949 in order to try to confuse the communists about what he was going to do. That didn't really mean much in the end, but I suppose it gave him some satisfaction. Chiang Kai-shek actually moved himself to Taiwan and made that his headquarters in June of 1949. Now this is almost 4 months before the communists declared victory in Tiananmen Square in Beijing on October 1st, 1949. And during this period, he was taking an airplane back and forth to Chongqing, his wartime capital, in Sichuan province in China's southwest, basically trying to keep things afloat. And he was also visiting Hainan Island, which is in the far south of China, just off the coast of North Vietnam. Hoping to keep the struggle alive, but gradually realizing that all was lost and that Chinese nationalist forces would have to retreat into Burma, which they did, Chiang Kai-shek eventually gave up and permanently situated himself in Taiwan and assumed that the communists would soon be attacking. He had assurances from the U.S. State Department that the United States would not assist if the communists did attack, and so he began preparing for that eventuality of defending Taiwan himself. In 1950, by the way, early 1950, Hainan Island also fell. Initially, the nationalists planned on holding on there as well, but they couldn't do it. So they began by killing an awful lot of people, and this is something that is very well known today, particularly among people who are not from the mainland in the last several generations. There's a lot of resentment toward the nationalists for the executions that they carried out during this period in 1949 and into 50. But that's what they did, and they were successful in imposing an uncompromising rule of the island. They declared martial law when they arrived, and martial law indeed stayed in force for several decades until after the death of Chiang Kai-shek later on. Now, he took some other steps as well of a more positive nature, stabilizing the currency, making clear that religious freedom was in place and that people could move as they wished. There was no totalitarian control like on the mainland, where religion was restricted, movement was restricted, jobs were restricted, and there was ideological imposition made on people's everyday lives. Those things didn't happen in Taiwan. On the other hand, if you tried to criticize the government or you were at all pro-communist, you were dead meat. So it was authoritarian, not totalitarian. Let's go on to slide 7. So then came the North's attack in June of 1950. Once that happened, there were movements made by the United States to support Korea immediately, South Korea, and the United States made a resolution in the United Nations Security Council to support South Korea. Unwisely, the Russians had decided to boycott that session, and so the vote was made. There was no Russian veto, and the United Nations decided to ask its members to support the South by force of arms. President Truman appointed Douglas MacArthur, the five-star general, the most senior man in the U.S. Army, to command UN forces, and without telling Truman, within a month after arriving in Korea, MacArthur traveled to Taiwan. He was received by Chiang Kai-shek, and he began an assessment, which was continued the next month, of the defense needs of Taiwan, which was a surprise to the White House. However, events were to show that MacArthur was no dummy. Events were to show that the momentum of U.S. involvement in Asia was certainly in the direction which would not only be convenient for support of Taiwan, it would actually become a necessary part of U.S. foreign policy. And this was Douglas MacArthur, the strategic thinker and the political operator, at work. There would be more problems with Douglas MacArthur as time went on, and Truman actually relieved him about 18 months later and replaced him because he spoke out so much against the administration's policies, which he considered to be not aggressive enough in Korea. I'll stop this recording here and continue on slide 8.